it is certainly a rough transition because being faithful is hard. Being faithful is putting yourself right on that cross with Jesus, allowing yourself to be nailed. If you're perfectly comfortable and happy, you might not be in a good spot. So that, I mean, we're called to be challenged, right? We're called to take up our crosses and follow Christ. And even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's inconvenient, and even if we don't maybe think that it's the right direction, maybe it's unjust, right? You have all those examples in throughout history of the unjust persecution of the saints, but they bore it with patience and with a spirit of humility. And that, having that example really helps us. I love to encourage people to immerse themselves in the lives of the saints, because when you do that, it gives you an example of how to live as an authentic Catholic, rather than some of these other, some other examples of maybe political people, right, who usually don't make the decisions according to the principles of virtue or the spiritual life, but rather expedience or what they think is right or according to their cause, right?
Wow.
But we're supposed to see not as with the eyes of the world, but with the eyes of Christ. And the saints help us to do that, because they did that in the context that they lived in.
Right. Right. That's awesome. It makes me think of even how so many traditionalists, they just love Padre Pio so much. And I love him too. I think he's awesome. But it's so interesting how certain aspects of his life aren't really talked about then. It's like he was unjustly suspended from his priestly ministry, but he didn't, open an appeal, and he didn't kick up a big storm or anything. He just waited it out because he knew that if he was faithful, God would give it back to him. And sure enough, that's what happened. And it was like, wow. I mean, that was hard. I mean, I've heard other priests talk about being suspended at times or a suspect of some kind of crime or something, and how miserable they were. They're just like, wow, I feel so like useless and misunderstood. Like I don't even know who I am anymore practically, but it passed because they endured.
That's right. Yeah. God always will eventually comes to the rescue of his faithful one, of his beloved. And yes, Padre Pio was such a great example to me of an authentic Catholic attitude toward the papacy, not one of just toleration. Well, of course, and definitely not one of disdain, but not one of toleration or one of just political expedience, but one of devotion. There were three items that the in his cell, in Padre Pio's cell, that he had, and it was a crucifix, a statue of Our Lady, and a picture of the Pope.
Oh.
And at the time, and that included Pope Paul VI. And that always struck me because, of course, Pope Paul VI, right, he oversaw the Second Vatican Council, the destruction of the Roman Rite. He did all these terrible things, right, according to the traditionalist narrative. How could Padre Pio have devotion to a man who is destroying the faith, right? And that already should be like a red flag. It's like, okay, don't you think that if Paul VI was evil and destroying the church, that maybe this prophetic figure, Padre Pio, would be used by God to highlight that, right? But no, it's the exact opposite. You have nothing but devotion. And when you look, and he even wrote his sister, who was having struggles with her convent, and he said, because they were going a little bit off the deep end, and he said, I know that you are right and they are wrong, but still you must obey, right? He had this right, spirit of obedience. And I know, even though he requested to be able to say the mass of his childhood, the mass of his ordination, right? To still say the 1962 rite of mass, if he had been, if Pope Paul VI had requested him to say the Reformed rite of mass, he would have done it in a heartbeat, because that was the level of his devotion to the papacy. Because when you look at how traditionalist Catholics, if it's not one of hatred and animosity toward the Pope, which it usually is, if it's not that, it's one of indifference, that he is a political figure of the church somewhere out there. And we tolerate him. And maybe sometimes, he has these roles in these very limited situations that almost happen never. But otherwise, he doesn't really have much relevance to my life. And
Right.
Devotion to the papacy is actually a fundamental part of a Catholic's life, of a Catholic spiritual life. Not just respect, not just assent, devotion to the papacy, right? And
Right.
it should send off warning bells when these people start calling those of us who are faithful to the popes papolaters, hyper papalists, that we're adoring the popes, right? That's such a ludicrous. Well, maybe there are some people out there who have an exaggerated notion of the papacy. Sure.
Yeah.
I think they're few and far between. I think most people are probably not going to tell you that if the Pope said Italian sausages are better than Polish sausages, that he's infallible, or that something he did in an interview is infallible, or anything like that, right? I mean, that's going to be pretty rare. Most people do not see the Pope as a god, right? So that's setting up a straw man. That's setting up a caricature. But we're called to more than just seeing him as a figurehead. We're called to devotion to him as our Father. Because in the Pope, we see Christ, we see the authority of Christ. It's in the Pope that Christ makes his authority present to us. And that's all the religious orders, all of the faithful religious orders that have stood the test of time are because they have been devoted to the papacy. The papacy, and through that, the papacy has shown its favor, its love, and its approbation, and they have blossomed and flourished within the church, right?
Right.
So it's so good to remember that, and to remember that the papacy isn't just again, he's not just a political figure. We can't reduce that role just to that. That's very unhealthy.
Right. Well, I mean, you even told me you're in the chapel you attended growing up. They had a picture of the Pope. Did they also have one of the bishop, or just the Pope?
Oh, in our chapel, I think they had. I know they had the Pope. They may have had
But he
the
was
bishop.
in the sacristy.
I have seen. Yeah, I'd seen bishops. Yeah, like often they will have the bishop as well. If they don't have the bishop, they at least have the Pope. But yeah, they usually have the picture hanging up.
Right. But he's in the sacristy, like where only the servers and the priests are even going to see him. But in the entrance of the church, where like diocesan parishes all have the Pope and the bishop's pictures, they have a picture of Archbishop Lefebvre. Yes. It's like, it makes me think about wacko parishes where they put the Eucharistic, the tabernacle in a little separate room off to the side where you like walk and you're like, where's Jesus? But it's like that. You're doing that with the Pope. You're sticking him in a corner where nobody's even going to see him, let alone, even just to think of him and pray for him.
No,
it's like,
it's a sign. It's a signification. It's a sign of an invisible reality, right? Which is exactly what they've done to the Pope in real life, right? Put him in the corner, put him in the sacristy, look over and,
that's how important Father is.
There's that heretic. Yeah, he's our wayward Father. Him. Like we don't have anything to do with. Yeah. No, it definitely is a symbol of the attitude toward the papacy. And it's really bizarre. One of the last debate discussion that I had with a SSPX priest, he had this odd, when I started pointing to him that his order, the SSPX's position toward the papacy and toward the church were actually untraditional, and were not authentic examples of Christian obedience. He proceeded to yell at me and tell me that I needed to know my place, and that there was no one who were more faithful to the Pope than the SSPX and the priests of the SSPX, that they were the most faithful of anyone in the church to them. I mean, he couldn't back that up. All he could do was scream it at me. But it just goes to show that they have this narrative that says we're actually being faithful. We're being more faithful to the Pope than anyone else is because we're preserving tradition. And that's what the Pope would really want us to do. So we're actually being more faithful to the Pope. So we're actually more loyal to him, right? So they have this whole thing that they do to convince themselves that what they're doing is right. And when you start calling that into question, they often proceed to get very nervous or emotional.
Well, because they know better. just like every other heretic in church history or schismatic, they knew better than the rest of the church. They knew better than the Father. It's like saying, I'm a child who hasn't talked to my parents for decades, but I'm a better child than the rest of you because I'm really doing what I should be doing as a good child. My parents just don't understand it. Nobody gives me any credit for it. And it's like, and I'm persecuted because I'm in the right. So that's a sign that I'm in the right because I'm being persecuted for it. And it's like,
yeah,
that's a really interesting corner to back yourself into.
Yeah, it is. It's amazing how we can convince ourselves, right? We can convince ourselves of what we're doing and what it's right. And we can come up with very sophisticated reasons, right, for doing it. But the definition of heresy, right, when you look at the etymology of the word, it's to choose one's own will, to choose one's own way. The heretic is the one who rejects the authority of the church, rejects the doctrines that they don't like, and accepts the doctrines that they do, and comes up with reasons to justify what they've done, right? That's what heresy is. It's a choosing of your own will above the will of the church.
Oh, wow.
Schism the same way, right? But heresy is in the realm of belief and the faith, and schism is in the realm of action and, the life of the church.